Hello, and welcome to Gaspar's History Podcast. This is Gaspar, and I am honored to continue the Meathound series with episode 1525. Not 1525, but simply 25. The Meathound series centers itself on the Lieutenant David A. Steele Jr. crew of the 423rd Bomb Squadron 306 Bomb Group, who were fighting in the 8th Air Force European Theater of Operations from 1942 to 1943. The Meathound series gets its name from the Boeing B-17 Model F number 4229524, which the Steele crew flew for several missions in 1943. I started this journey way too late in life, but now that I am on it, I get the pleasure of learning more about the young men and women in our story, and what they did and what they struggled through. I also get the excitement of researching, sharing stories and anecdotes of my discoveries while looking for something else. I made contact with another crew member's family, Walter Petrowski, the young man tucked into the ball turret gun position of our missions. If the Petrowski family is listening today, welcome, and thank you for sharing more about your father. Making contact with veterans' families and engaging with them has been the most rewarding experience of them all. I hope these stories do justice to the trials and tribulations of these young men and their families. Most of these young men saw and did things they never wanted to talk about again. For many, it was a silent platform from which to build a future. But sadly, for others, like my grandfather, it was a part of their life that simply enhanced their demons rather than exercising them. We find that when these veterans did talk, they wanted to talk about their friends, their families, and the laughs that they had, and they always got emotional when talking about a friend who did not make it home. Let us not forget that each man and each woman handled the routines of war in different ways, their way. For those of us who have not been in combat, facing our foe eye to eye, we should be careful in how we judge their way of handling the war and its tribulations. We should rather learn from their experiences, understand the impact that their repressed emotions had on their health, and work to build a society that smothers the want and need to delight in human suffering. Further, we should take our learning and empathy and support our current veterans who are struggling with their demons. With that, let's take this episode off the ground by jumping back in time to better understand how the past is never dead. It's not even past. Thank you, William Faulkner, for the quote. Sit back, relax, and let me tell you a story of incredible firsts, unbelievable feats, and raw courage from a group of young men who were mostly in their early 20s, dealing with the most daunting task before them, the liberation of a continent and its people. We have gone back in time to December 12, 1942. The Steele crew arrived at Thurlai, which I have been mispronouncing through all of these episodes, which is more evidence how this is a continual learning experience. They were now part of the 423rd Bomb Squadron 306 Bomb Group, the Grim Reapers. The 306 was in the middle of an influenza outbreak, so they were low on flyers. It is important to understand that at this point in our story, crews and their aircraft were in short supply. The Steele crew were some of the first replacements to arrive, and even though they were not part of the originals, they were a welcome sight. The Steele crew would be sent to Bassingbourn for 2 weeks of intense combat training. At least, that is what was supposed to have happened. Second Lieutenant David Steele went to sleep on the evening of the 11th, thinking he would be in training tomorrow. Little did he know he was about to get on-the-job training. Steele was tapped on the shoulder early in the morning and informed he would be flying with Uncle Bill Warner's crew as their co-pilot, because Warner's co-pilot was out of commission. Steele reminisced years later that he was probably selected due to the number of flying hours he had accumulated, but that was speculation. Who knows how the Army Air Corps actually makes their decisions. December 12th was going to be Steele's first mission in combat, and Lieutenant Uncle Bill Warner would be a calming presence, even though it looks like, as I wade through my past reports, it was only going to be Warner's second combat mission. Steele went through the routine of the reveal, then pilot's review. He grabbed a survival kit, turned in his personal items, and headed for his assigned aircraft. As Steele approached the olive drab beauty, it felt a little different today, and it should. He walked her perimeter, inspecting her up and down with a little more diligence. He was about to fly a real combat mission, and everything felt a little more real. Steele decided he would get into the aircraft via the right waist fuselage door. He grabbed onto the edge of the fuselage and pulled himself into the aircraft, and found himself standing at the center of the gangplank of the big, beautiful bird. The crew was chatting and working on their positions, and Steele took it all in. Then, with a tremendous bang, burst, rat-a-tat-tat. Staff Sergeant Colin Neely's right waist Browning machine gun fired a burst of 50 caliber machine gun bullets into the aircraft. Bullets zipped past Steele's right side. He was frozen, and it was over in a second. It was a good thing that Steele did not move, because the slightest movement to the right in reacting to the blast would have cut him in half, and there would be no Uncle David and Aunt Bee and no Meathound series. Fate had spared him, but not the aircraft. The plane had its horizontal stabilizer shot off, along with part of the rear of the aircraft. The whole crew was stunned. Staff Sergeant Neely ran to Steele's aid in the most apologetic way. Steele was unharmed. He was shaken, but not stirred. The crew could hear Staff Sergeant Counts yelling from the tailgun position with a heightened and animated voice. You know the one, high-pitched and crackly? He too was okay, equally shaken and unharmed. It was an accident, and Staff Sergeant Neely was not quite sure what had happened, but the plane needed significant repair. Steele had been shot down, and he was not even in the air yet. This event is not noted or documented in the unit history, other than Steele's oral history of the event. Here is where the story gets some legs. How is it that Second Lieutenant Steele is boarding an aircraft when the tail is shot out of the plane, yet he and Uncle Bill Warner are in formation at the start of the mission? This means the ground crews had to get a replacement plane, arm it, load it, put a few bombs in the rack, charge it, and fuel it. That is really a miracle and another testament to the quality of the 306 ground crews. What we also know is that the Warner crew made their way to the DFC aircraft, and she was flown by Warner and Steele. That in itself is a miracle, and yet there is no documentation of the event. Sad. This was an ominous start for Second Lieutenant Steele during a time when completing a tour of duty was stacked against you, and as Uncle Bill, Steele, and the DFC made their way into France, Steele witnessed his first B-17 explode, disintegrating in front of him with no survivors, and he thought to himself, what have I gotten myself into? The harp music plays and our story moves back to present story time, April 4th, 1943. The Steele crew and the Meathound take a trip to Paris, where they bomb the Renault factory. It was a milestone mission, and it was the first time a bomb group put 30 aircraft in the air, the 306 Bomb Group first. The next day, April 5th, 306 Bomb Group 423rd Squadron and the Steele crew would fly again. This time, not only will the mission reach another milestone, but it has the most catastrophic of outcomes, and they are not even going to Saint Nazaire. April 5th, 1943. The 8th Air Force Bomber Command had not quite made 25 missions an official tour of duty. Some may argue about this timing, and frankly, there's mixed results when you research it. My statement is based on the ever-reliable diary of Dr. Thurman Schiller, the 306 Bomb Group surgeon, who deeply connected to the pursuit of an official tour of duty. Schiller had been advocating for a 20-mission tour of duty since late in 1942, when the, quote, originals and their replacements were getting shot to pieces. Dr. Schiller notes that the official tour of duty date is April 8, 1943, and the official number is 25. No matter the number, 20 or 25, it was the fact that any number was critical to the morale of a group of men who knew the odds were stacked against them, and to their families and loved ones who missed them. On this day, April 5, 1943, it was also very clear that no matter the official number and its timing, bomb groups were going to implement their own temporary versions of the tour of duty rule until formalities could take hold, whenever that would come. It is interesting to note that the 306 had been on a good luck streak, and other than losing Staff Sergeant Raymond Henn, the group had fared well over the last couple of months. Today will be different. The 306 Bomb Group crews and armorers worked non-stop since the aircraft had returned from Paris late yesterday. The Meat Hound had not sustained any significant battle damage, so she was quickly set up for today's mission. However, the pilots and Staff Sergeant Walter Petrowski reported that the interphone in the ball turret gun position was not working, and it would be nice if it were repaired. Staff Sergeant Petrowski was already in a lonely position. He did not need to be cut off from the rest of the crew. Plus, it was dangerous when the crew had to keep checking if his oxygen was working, which would then leave their positions unguarded. Let's move to the afternoon of April 5th to give you a feel for what is about to come. The ground crews in their olive drab, grease-stained overalls were on the edge of the runway. Many had their bikes and were ready to ride. The whole of the bomb group was out, watching and waiting. 2 aircraft had returned early due to malfunctions, but now everyone was anxiously awaiting the rest of the aircraft, especially today. There was lots of chatter. You know, can he beat the odds? If anyone can defy the odds, it would be him. Their minds were racing. Their eyes were fixed on the horizon. There they are, someone shouted, and it was like a rock in the water. The ripple carried through the crowd. You could hear the counting. 1, 2, 3, 4. Not everyone was on the same count, so many became frustrated and started again. 1, 2, 3, 12, 13, 14, 14. That can't be right. God, no. Please, God, not today. The returning aircraft started to launch red flares, the sign that help was needed. The bomb group's emergency crews scrambled. The chaplain was on call, and everyone had a pit in their stomach. There were 4 missing aircraft. That can't be right. Count again. 14. Technical Sergeants Ray Stymax and Michael Roskovich had been friends since Scott Field Radio School in September 1941. They were then assigned to the 423rd Squadron of the 306th in Wendover, Utah, which means they were 2 of the originals. They shipped over to England in the summer of 1942, where Roskovich would be assigned to Yuri's crew, and Stymax would eventually be assigned to the Steel crew after their original operator, Pyre, got into some kind of trouble or simply fell apart. But what we do know is that Pyre never flew a mission. Stymax and Roskovich were the best of friends in the worst of times. Michael Roskovich had been integral to our story, a charismatic 20-year-old from a large Russian family. I have shared with you his ability to cut off officers' ties if they dare wear one on his aircraft, his love of photography, and how on at least one occasion he was taking pictures of attacking fighters instead of manning his machine gun, which bothered the rest of the crew. He had an affinity for dropping fake bombs out of the bomb bay doors and walked around camp wondering if the squareheads had figured out it was a fake. From what I have read, I don't think Michael Roscovich had an enemy in the camp and was truly a friend to all. In addition to Stymax, Roski, as he was called, was also close to Corporal Fran Wall, the bomb group photographer. These young men had formed a bond in the middle of a war, which is one of the most enduring bonds of all. Can you imagine the storytelling, the laughing, drinking, and frolicking? It is hard to truly know how close these young men were until something tragic happened. The Stymax, Roscovich, and Walls were just like so many others away from home, scared, but showing a brave facade and hoping their armor does not crack. But man, oh man, has the armor been cracking, and each mission gets a little worse. Today was supposed to be a milk run and a celebratory day, but it was turning into a nightmare where statistics and casualties were catching up to the 306th. Many in the crowd had pits in their stomachs. It was more than a pit. It was a rock. They felt sick, and they were wondering if the mad Russian had made it or not. Corporal Wall was not in the crowd, and that was odd. Let me tell you who is in the crowd, though. Our good friend, Andy Rooney, who was there to get a story. It seems that Corporal Wall had decided to jump on Yuri's aircraft and hitch a ride to document the 25th. You say 25th, Gaspar? What do you mean? I mean, today was the 25th mission for Michael Roscovich and an end to his tour of duty, which would be the first for the 8th Air Force if he can pull it off. Captain Yuri was a great pilot, and when he found out Corporal Wall wanted a ride, especially today, he chewed him up and down, and in a very direct, stern voice made it very clear that if some ride-along screws up the oxygen or anything else and forces us to abort, he would string them up. Now get on the aircraft and don't touch anything. Now that you know how Corporal Wall got on the aircraft and why he wanted a ride, let's jump back to the mission reveal. The briefing room with its stale air was tidy with rows of chairs and airmen smoking, laughing, wagering on the location. They were young men full of piss and vinegar. As the crews came in, many with their hats dominating their heads like some kind of costume, they conversed with their nervous energy wound up in them. You don't think it's Saint Nazaire, do you? I bet it's Saint Nazaire. Steele was thinking to himself, I hope it isn't Saint Nazaire. But the fact was, it didn't matter where it was. No mission was safe, especially a milk run. Today was Steele's first back-to-back days flying, and the realities of war had set in. He thought to himself, it's good to get a mission count, but the voice in the back of his head was chirping like a countdown. You know, like fate is reminding you of what is coming. Steele, like the others, had that wry smile on his face, trying not to show the clenched teeth as the big blue tarp was pulled from the map. There was a little relief and a lot of curiosity. The target was Erla Aircraft Repair Facility at Morcel, near Antwerp. The bomb group was going into Belgium to wipe out some aircraft repair facilities. Yesterday's mission to Paris had gone a long way to dampen Nazi truck and vehicle production. Today, on the 8th Air Force's 50th mission, they would look to tighten the noose on the Luftwaffe by cleaning out their repair facility. The crews liked it. Some called it a milk run, which a lot of the chaps found favor with. You could look around the room and wonder if there were any spies in the room. No, can't be. But it would be like the Luftwaffe had sat through the briefing and they would be waiting for the 306th. And just like that fateful trip to Paris aircraft facility in December of 1942, the Luftwaffe seemed to take a tax on their stuff personally. The build-up for this mission continued to grow when the crews found out the general was going for a ride-along. You're probably thinking to yourself, Gaspar, what general? General Frank Armstrong, that's who. He was in Third Life for the day, and he was going to hitch a ride-along with his old bomb group. Steele thought very highly of General Armstrong, and he believed that the general had gotten the 306 back into shape after that early year disaster to St. Nazaire. Not to mention, he had led them first into Germany, and that would be a story he could tell forever. The 423rd Squadron was being led today by Major Lambert, the Midway battle veteran, which I just love thinking about. The meat hound was Steele, Bamforth, Petrowski, Hull, Stymax, and Smoot would be tucked into his right flank in the lead element, number 2 position. The briefing ended with good luck and happy hunting, and the crews dispersed to their respective breakout meetings, where they went through their routines and then they headed for their aircraft. 20 of them today. Not as many as yesterday, but a full complement, which again is a testament to the ground crews and a reminder that the new crews were arriving daily. There were newbies flying today, some of which had just gotten back from combat training in Bassingbourn, and one chap who had actually come in that morning. They were a few hours away from seeing for themselves how they had been lied to and how the training propaganda was just that, exaggerated truths. As the crews headed for their planes, there was one crew of interest today, and it was how I opened the story. The spotlight was on Captain Yuri's crew, and the young man of interest was Tech Sergeant Michael Roskovich, because today would be his 25th mission, half of the 8th Air Force's missions in the European Theater of Operations. Half, I say. That in itself is a milestone. Roskovich was going to see if he could be the first to complete 25 missions, thereby finishing a tour of duty. The Luftwaffe was going to have something to say about that, because so far they had not let any airman complete 25 missions. The meat hound sat on the tarmac behind Major Lambert, waiting for her turn. It always seemed like it took forever. The waiting was hell. The time was 12:43 hours. The airfield was abuzz. Major Wilson and Captain Regan, with their special guest General Armstrong in Dark Horse, throttled up, and the festivities began. The rest of the bomb group followed. Lieutenant Steele sat in the captain's chair, thinking of his responsibilities. With the fast-past memories of his mom, dad, brother, and Bee, Steele was looking out over the field. It was always quite the scene. Lieutenant Jones was in the co-pilot seat. The engineer was the ever-reliable Tech Sergeant Bamforth. The bombardier toggler was the stern-faced Staff Sergeant Hull. Staff Sergeant Hull was coaching up rookie navigator, Second Lieutenant David Nordberg, who had arrived on March 12th. Second Lieutenant Nordberg will be on Wigington's crew on the May St. Nazaire mission, so pocket that nugget for later. Tech Sergeant Stymax was on the radio, and Staff Sergeant Petrowski was in the ball turret gun position. Staff Sergeant Smoot was in the tail, and the meat hound's gunners today are Sergeant Porcelli and Sergeant Stokowski. The meat hound had a good crew and would break in a new navigator. Across the English Channel sat a very experienced and determined group of Luftwaffe flyers who were waiting for Red Rover, send the 306th right over. In episode 10, Uncle Bill, we are introduced to Luftwaffe pilot Otto Stamberger, Stato as he was called, who is now the rank of Oberlieutenant and was flying 4th Staffel JG-26. Stato will once again be waiting for the 306 bomb group as they finish their bomb run, and once again he will shoot one of them down. Arguably, the most famous of the Luftwaffe pilots flying today is Captain Wilhelm Ferdinand Galland of JG-26. The Galland name was iconic within the Luftwaffe and nearly on par with the likes of Richthofen, Voss, and Udet. Dare I say Goering? Nope, not going to do it. I had to erase my original editorial comment as it was a little edgy for the show. The last two Luftwaffe pilots of interest today are Captain Fritz Gieshardt and Major Joseph Pips Priller, both of whom were also flying in JG-26. I am sure some of you will recognize Pips Priller, especially after I remind you he was the pilot that strafed the Normandy beaches on D-Day, lived to talk about it, and found himself getting a scene in the movie The Longest Day. Not him, but an actor playing him. 3 of the experienced Luftwaffe pilots I just named will shoot down a B-17 bomber out of the 306th Squadron today, making it a very dark day for the 306th indeed. The 306th will have the lead today and will be escorted to and from the Belgian coast by the highly capable Royal Air Force, flying the iconic Spitfire Mark 9 variant with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine that hums, baby. The 9 squadrons of Spitfires would try to lure the Luftwaffe into an engagement, but as usual, the Luftwaffe declines, so the Spits will have to provide cover once the bomb group is back near the Belgium coast. The Luftwaffe said to the Spitfires, "No worries, we will escort them from here," and boy, do they ever. The Meat Hound in her olive drab paint had her determined eyes fixed on Major Lambert and the DFC. Lieutenant Jones had pocketed the checklist and the crew were in takeoff positions. The Meat Hound's 4 Wright-Patterson Cyclone engines were buzzing and everything had checked out. The number 3 engine was leaking a little oil, but that seems to be her preference. Each crew member processed fear differently. It was the quiet times in the aircraft that were the worst. Once the fighting started, the mind did not have a chance to wander. The crew would be in combat positions, engaged in oxygen regulation, maintenance, flying, first aid, and fighting. Those were all distractions of duty, which was good. Distractions of daydreaming were bad. The waiting was really hard. I wish we could smoke. I need a cigarette. Takeoffs were becoming routine. They at least felt that way. There was nothing routine about managing a 4-engine aircraft with 6,000 pounds of munitions. Maybe I am confusing routine with comfort. Maybe the crews were comfortable with their jobs and the flying of the aircraft, and for some, that might translate to routine. It was the Meat Hound's turn, and she was ready. Steele throttled up the engines and released the brake. The Meat Hound jumped forward. The crew could feel the tarmac under the wheels, and she rolled down the runway, her momentum building. She was in pursuit of Major Lambert, who was gaining altitude and banking into a turn. Lieutenant Jones called out the speed, and the Meat Hound slowly lifted off the ground with that ever-present feeling of, is she going to make it? The Cyclone engines roared, begging for the pure octane fuel. Steele's eyes were forward, then down on the instruments, then back up. He was slowly pulling back on the wheel, watching his airspeed and being cautious not to stall. The Meat Hound started to lift more rapidly, and Jones brought the wheels up as Steele took her into a bank, looking for Major Lambert and the DFC as his point of reference. The crew would soon get up and head for their positions. This was no drill. So far, all was good and all was right. What a day this was turning out to be. I wonder what we are in for. They wondered indeed, and they continued their duties without distraction. Radio and wireless operator Stymax had his own little room, more like a closet, with a small working table and chair. He also had a Browning machine gun and a small viewing area out the top of the fuselage for which he could provide a defense. Steinmax, unlike his friend Roski, was not inclined to photograph out of his viewing window when Luftwaffe fighters were attacking. His headset was on and the airwaves were clear. He knew what today meant to the 306 Bomb Group and, frankly, the 8th Air Force. He was confident and optimistic about the day. Staff Sergeant Petrowski was getting into his ball turret gun position. It was not an easy jump in and climb out. It was a process and took a little time. His parachute is left in the fuselage as there is no room for it in his position. Tech Sergeant Bamforth was tucked in behind the pilots, bobbing like a prairie dog in his top turret gun, then back down to assist the pilots. Each view from the top turret gun revealed a glorious sight of bombers heading for Belgium. The Meadhound's altitude crossed over 10,000 feet and the crew went on oxygen. Lieutenant Jones started the touch points to make sure everyone's oxygen is working properly. Petrowski was the happiest of them all. His interphone was working today. Staff Sergeant Smoot reported in on how the Meadhound was positioned and the status of the rest of the bomb group and the other bomb groups that were joining the lead dog today. The English Channel was fast approaching, and the Meadhound's guns would need to be tested. So far in this series, the Meadhound's guns had performed very well, with no reports of malfunctions or issues. Everyone loved the sound of that Browning rat-a-tat-tat, and they knew what it meant. The Meadhound's altitude was now near 23,000 feet, and it was very cold. The waist gunners, Stokowski and Porcelli, stood at their positions and weathered the cold rushing air as the Meadhound was cruising on the right side of Major Lambert. Steele had a nice view of Major Lambert. It was almost like you could reach out and touch the other aircraft. The Meadhound's crews were locked in to their positions. They were not quite antsy, but their nerves were heightened, and they knew they were close to being targeted. And, as they were the lead bomb group today, the Luftwaffe liked to attack the leaders as to discombobulate the whole attack. The Meadhound's crew also knew the Luftwaffe pilots generally waited until the Spitfire escorts were forced to turn back before they attacked. But that had not happened yet, so they were still playing the waiting game. The 368th Squadron was flying the tip of the spear today, with Major Wilson flying point. The rest of the 368th made up the rest of the two elements. Leading the second element was Captain Smiley in 41-24560, Little Audrey. The elements of the 368 were off to the left and a little below the 423rd Grim Reapers. As they crossed 23,000 feet, Captain Smiley and Little Audrey peeled off, turning back for Thurley, with the number 4 engine out and not working. Staff Sergeant Hull had a good view and reported it in to the pilots. It looks like the 306 will be down in aircraft before they ever get to Belgium. The chatter between the crew was normal. The usual bets were made, one-way trash talking on what Jerry can expect today, reminders on oxygen levels, electric suits, and lead your targets. Staff Sergeant Hull was telling Second Lieutenant Nordberg about the time the Luftwaffe planes dropped a bomb and everyone could see the explosion, which looked like the biggest anti-aircraft shell exploding that anyone had ever seen, and how they speculated that Jerry had come up with a new anti-aircraft gun better than the 88s. Their nerves were now a little worse. They knew what was coming. They just did not know how bad. So far, the wireless was quiet. Radio silence was intact. Truth was, it would be most likely the 306 that breaks the radio silence, as it will most likely be them under the gun first. Tech Sergeant Steinmax had a job to do, and he had fellow flyers that were relying on him. But like everyone else on the Meadhound, he had others that he would think about when those fleeting moments presented themselves. Today was about his friend Roscoe. He knew his friend was flying the slot in the second element, which put Yuri's crew in the tail, sitting in the high squadron position. Tech Sergeant Steinmetz knew Yuri and Sugg were good pilots, and he had confidence in them. Well, everything seemed to be in order, and the Meathound crew was a little relaxed. Something happened without any warning, and to everyone's surprise. Bang! The vibrations reverbed through the Meathound. She shuddered. The number 4 engine outside of Lieutenant Jones's window was smoking. Everyone quickly went to heightened attention. No one saw anything. The manifold pressure was quickly dropping. Tech Sergeant Bamforth could not see any enemy aircraft. Staff Sergeant Petrowski could not see any enemy aircraft. Staff Sergeant Smoot could not see any enemy aircraft. Staff Sergeants Stokowski and Porcelli reported in the same. The Meathound had blown the number 3 cylinder head in the number 4 engine. Steele and Jones made an adjustment to the manifold pressure. There was nothing engineer Tech Sergeant Bamforth could do other than help the pilots adjust the pressure and gauges to make sure nothing gets out of hand. Steele and Jones had a short conversation and made the decision they were finished for the day. The number 4 engine continued to smoke. Then, in short order, the supercharger in the number 4 engine went out. They were done for sure. It was an easy decision. Lieutenant Steele was not going to push the Meathound over enemy territory with the number 4 engine in peril. Lieutenant Steele gently rolled her out of formation after getting an update from Staff Sergeant Smoot on the bomb group's formation. An abort. The Meathound was aborting. It was Steele and Jones's second. It was legit, but the pilots did not want the reputation of aborting, especially at the last moment. It was equally dangerous to be cavalier, which put the whole crew in danger, not to mention the Meathound, and sadly, there are many stories like that we could pursue. It was the right decision, but one Steele and Jones knew would come with some scrutiny, especially from their co-pilots, who would not know the reason until they came home, if they come home. Not to mention, it was now the second abort of the day, which again did not look good, but there was comfort in that it was a legitimate abort. Tech Sergeant Steinmetz was not going to be able to keep a third eye on his friend that day, and he was sad. As the Meathound headed for home, Captain Yuri moved out of the slot and into the number 2 position of the 423rd Squadron, assuming the right side of the first element, the Meathound's previous position. Tech Sergeant Roskovich just replaced his friend, Tech Sergeant Steinmetz, in the formation, and that seemed very fitting. The Meathound and her crew were headed back to Thurley, where they would play the waiting game with everyone else. It was bad enough that the Meathound had to turn back, but to add insult to injury, they would not get a mission count. The crew got up early, went to the meetings and their breakout sessions, prepared the aircraft, and for what? Not even a count. These were the worst kinds of missions. Okay, that's not true. The worst missions were where they lost fellow flyers. So what would today feel like when they lose fellow flyers and they don't get a mission count? Lieutenants Jones and Steele had other issues, and they could not fret about the abort. They needed to know if they could salvo the bomb load. Jones was on the interphone with the newbie navigator, 2nd Lieutenant Nordberg. He wanted to know if there was anywhere to unload the payload, get rid of the bombs. The pilots did not like returning with a full bomb rack. Think about it. It simply added a spice to landing that no one needed or wanted. 2nd Lieutenant Nordberg did not have any good options, so it looks like the Meathound was coming home with a full rack and extra prayers. It was a smooth flight back to Thurley, but they still had to land. Steele and Jones guided her gently while the crew said a prayer or two. Steele took a little more of the runway to apply a gentle touch so as not to rupture a tire with the extra weight. Success. They were on the ground without incident. Steele would taxi her in, and the Meathound was taken offline for 3 days to replace the number 4 engine. No need to worry about gossip. The Meathound would be offline for 3 days. It was nice to have replacement planes and crews and not have to rush replacing an engine like in the old days. Wait, the old days were less than 5 months ago. The Meathounders wrapped up their reports, got some coffee and some food, then wandered to the field with the rest of the gaggle. Back in Belgium, things were not going well, and believe it or not, this was supposed to be a milk run, but it was turning into a turkey shoot. The 306 had been lucky for several months, but today the odds were about to catch them. Captain Reber, years later, was vocal and highly agitated that this mission was called a milk run. A milk run is a quick and easy delivery mission, one that should be no problem. We have discussed Steele's thoughts on milk runs, so I don't know that he was really all that upset that he had to abort out of a milk run. Let me add this. Steele commented on his disdain for milk runs years later. So the fact is, this is one of those days and milk runs that probably made him mad and built his disdain. The remaining mission into Belgium for the 306 Bomb Squadron is worthy of hours of discussion and debate. As bad as I want to dive into the rest of the story, I'm going to have to let it pass due to the unfinished work before me. But if you are interested, this mission to Antwerp is a historian's dream. Again, I am drawn to it like a moth to flame, so curious as to what I might discover while looking for something else. But sadly, I will have to leave the details for another day. Instead, I will share a few stories and anecdotes, then guide the bloody 306th back to Thurlai. With the question remaining before us, can Tech Sergeant Roskovich safely complete his 25 missions? As the Meathound was coming into Thurlai, the rest of the 306 bomb group was attacked by one of the most ferocious and consistent Luftwaffe attacks to date. The Luftwaffe assault was led by some of the Luftwaffe's best and most famous pilots. Wave after wave of Focke-Wulf 190s and Me 109s dove on the 306th. The pilots and crews that made it back to Thurlai dotted their reports with, "I don't know, we were busy or we were evading." The message for the S2s in the briefing room was, we were under constant pressure in adverse conditions, which included evading during the bomb run. Now, that's how bad it was. Oh, I wonder how Roscoe is holding up. Poor, poor, poor Purple Heart Corner, being occupied today by the 367th Bomb Squadron, aka the Clay Pigeons. It was not a good day to be a clay pigeon in a turkey shoot. I used the puns and descriptions to add emphasis to the reason this section of the formation was so accurately named Purple Heart Corner, and how in our previous missions we have seen the havoc this section of the formation had endured. Today, the pain was felt by the 306th, and it reached a new level. Within a 40-minute window of time, the scene in real life was something that movies or masters of the air could only hope to create. Film, as badly as we want it to be real, falls a little short. The real-life villains, Galan, Stamberger, and Adolf Gluntz, will shoot down 3 of our heroes in Purple Heart Corner, flying with the 367th Bomb Squadron. Lieutenant Parker in 42-5072, a no-name deputy. Lieutenant Ross in 42-29660, Little Abner. And Lieutenant Fisher in 42-5431, Little Abner. The whole element of Purple Heart corner. Gone, gone, gone. The other crews tried counting their shoots when they could, but the intensity of the day did not afford a good look at the downed aircraft. Self-preservation had kicked in. You're probably saying to yourself, Gaspar, you say Little Abner twice, and you would be correct. That was not a mistake. It seems both aircraft were named Little Abner. Of course, both aircraft named after the beloved comic strip of the 1930s, Little Abner. 3 aircraft are down, and I shared with you only 14 aircraft returned to base. The bomb group launched 20 aircraft. 2 aircraft, one of which was the Meathound, has returned to Thurlai with mechanical issues. That leaves 1 aircraft to go. I wonder if Michael Roskovich is going to survive the day. Things were not going well in any of the squadrons. The lead formation in aircraft Dark Horse, being piloted by Major Wilson and Captain Reber with their special guest General Armstrong, have the nose of their aircraft pummeled by cannon fire. The exploding cannon shells ignite the ammunition in the nose of the aircraft. She quickly filled with smoke, and then Bomb Group Navigator Captain Salternick was severely wounded in the leg, either by an exploding 50 caliber ammunition round or fragments from the 20mm cannon shells. The general jumped into action, feeling his way into the nose of the aircraft and applying a tourniquet to Salternick. The cold air was rushing in, and it helped to slow the blood flow. Captain Salternick was arguing that he had a job to do and he needed to be at his post. The general disagreed, while the crew tried to stop the bleeding. Captain Salternick would soon be in critical condition, while continuing to argue he should be navigating. From what I have read, this young man was well liked, admired, and his actions of the day spoke to his character. I wonder how Roscoe is doing. There were no photographs taken by Roskovich. He was actually quite busy. Corporal Wall was thinking less about photographs and more about what have I gotten myself into. Then the call, bandit, bandit, 1 o'clock high. The interphone was loud and clear. A Focke-Wulf 190 with her deadly array of weapons focused on the Old Faithful and dove straight on her. The cannon shells ripped through the Old Faithful as the Focke-Wulf zipped by with lightning speed. Captain Urey and Lieutenant Sugg could feel the impact in the controls, and she was loose, but they still had control for now. Staff Sergeant Randall from his right waist gun position could see the damage, and he reported it in. Captain, the elevator and stabilizer are badly shot up, sir. Urey and Sugg knew there was not much more they could take. Lieutenant Sugg asked for casualties and battle damage, and the interphone lit up with "That was close," as the crew reported in safe. Here they come again. Staff Sergeant McClure in Old Faithful's ball turret had the English sights, and he was thinking to himself, "These sure are nice." The Old Faithful's gunners continued their defense. Think about what that means. These young men were at their gun positions reacting to enemy attacks. It was not uncommon for the enemy aircraft to attack 6 at a time. Both sides staring at each other in the face and shooting at each other at hundreds of miles an hour with little time to react. On Old Faithful's left was DFC with Major Lambert and Lieutenant George. Staff Sergeant McLennan was also in the ball turret gun position when he picked up a Focke-Wulf 190 attacking the first element from 4 o'clock and below. This Focke-Wulf was ill-tempered and had both the Old Faithful and the DFC in her line of sight. The DFC seemed to be the primary target in order to disrupt the leader of the element and scatter the aircraft. Staff Sergeant McLennan opened fire at distance, and the Browning machine guns responded with rat-a-tat-tat-tat. He paused, refocused, and fired again. The Focke-Wulf was closing fast, and the planes were now exchanging gunfire. Tech Sergeant McGregor from the engineer's turret could see the yellow-nosed bastard, but he could not depress his guns far enough to get a shot. The Focke-Wulf was now within 200 yards when Staff Sergeant McClennan's Brownings found their target, and in the most incredible of haste, the Focke-Wulf broke apart and exploded, disintegrating with no chute, one soul lost. The Old Faithful's crew cheered as the DFC picked up a kill. There was no rest for the weary, and the fighting continued. The kill by the DFC's McClennan was a reminder that in this aerial melee, the Luftwaffe was not without her losses. In another example of where the truth of what really happened lies somewhere in between the Allied and Luftwaffe mission reports, the 306 Bomb Squadron will claim 5 enemy aircraft shot down, but the Luftwaffe will only report 2. However, what the Luftwaffe could not dispute was the loss of Captain Fritz Giesant of 3rd Squadron JG-26, flying a Focke-Wulf 190A4 aircraft with number 7051. Giesant was mortally wounded early in the fighting and crashed his aircraft near Ghent at 15:15 hours. He was 24 years old and had been credited with over 100 aerial victories. In our story today, we are discussing the pursuit of 25 missions and a completed tour of duty for crew members in the 8th Air Force. The Luftwaffe's losses of Captain Giesart, who had been credited with over 100 down enemy aircraft. There was no tour of duty for Giesart or the other Luftwaffe flyers, and you have to think that their morale was such that they really knew they were not going to survive the war. The 306 gunners tried to defend their aircraft, and the pilots continued with the most violent of evasive maneuvers. Today was proving to be the most extreme of days. The Luftwaffe once again tried to bomb the bombers, with multiple aircraft reporting the attacks and bright flashes lighting up the sky. But they missed, and the tactic proved to be nothing other than a distraction. Once again, the Old Faithful and Roscovich would get a first-hand view of the enemy's tactics. The day continued to get worse. The 306 was limping home after a horrible bomb run. It was expected that during the bomb run there was to be no evasive action, but today that rule seemed to be more like a guideline due to the heavy pressure the Luftwaffe aircraft had put on the 306th. Bomb group records were very clear. The bombing was horrible due to the bombardiers not being able to get the target sighted due to all the evasive action that was being taken by the pilots just to keep the aircraft in the air. There is also evidence that some of the 306 bombs drifted into the Belgian communities, killing hundreds, if not thousands, of civilians. It was a bad day indeed, and it was not over yet. The 306 was fighting their way back to the coast with one whole element gone from the formation and the bomb group navigator severely wounded. Numerous planes badly shot up, and Michael Roscovich trying to hang on to complete his 25th mission. The clock was ticking, and they were still a long way from home. Waves of attacks were launched. The Luftwaffe was going to be persistent today. Captain Yuri and Lieutenant Sugg evaded as Major Lambert and Lieutenant George did the same. The first wave of Luftwaffe fighters had picked out their target. The yellow-nosed bastards ramped up speed and dove on the 306 with an aircraft fat in their sights. A blistering of cannon fire came through the squadron, and the first ship was hit and hit hard. She buckled and lost an engine. She was riddled with 20mm cannon fire as engineer Tech Sergeant S.P. Stimkowski put up a defense, but his twin Browning machine guns soon fell silent as the number 2 engine was knocked out. The pilot feathered the engine, and he knew they'd been hit hard and they were not going to be able to keep up. The co-pilot screamed through the interphone to prepare the escape hatches. The top turret gunner, Tech Sergeant S.P. Stemkowski, was dead, and he had the dubious honor of the shortest time with the 306 bomb group, a measly 12 hours. Yes, 12 hours. I guess the statistics were catching up with the 306th. The aircraft that was crippled drifted out of formation and soon was finished off in another pass by the pursuing Luftwaffe dogs. The aircraft and crew is an old friend of this series and a name that you have heard before, Montana Power, piloted by Lieutenant Silos and Lieutenant Kramarenko. Tech Sergeant Roskovich watched and counted 7 shoots. If the Luftwaffe records of timing align, then Lieutenant Silos and Montana Power were knocked out by Pips Priller, the future Normandy Beaches strafer and longest day movie star. As I mentioned earlier in this mission, there are many tangents that I'm just not going to be able to pursue, but know that the downing of the 306 planes put into motion the resistance, prisoners of war, and evasion, just like our friend Wisenbach, who was on his way back home out of the Nazis' grasp. The 306 bomb group historians, their pilots, crews, and their families traded correspondence with Belgian historians and enthusiasts for many years to come. So if that is your interest, I encourage you to start digging, because there is no telling what you may find when you are looking for something else. England was coming into sight. Captain Yuri and Lieutenant Sugg had taken battle damage, but none of the crew had been injured. As my mother used to say, they were on their last nerve, which growing up meant Mom was about to snap, so I better go outside and leave her alone. The pilots were on their last nerve, and the proximity to safety was making it worse. Corporal Wall was thinking to himself, "This is crazy. What have I gotten myself into?" Finally, the Old Faithful and her crew were going to make it home. They were now over the English coast and fully protected. They are shot up, so there is some flying to do, because landing was never guaranteed. But again, Captain Yuri and Lieutenant Sugg were good pilots. Tech Sergeant Michael Roskovich was going to be the first in the 8th Air Force to complete 25 missions. He wanted to celebrate in style and planned to jump out of the Old Faithful as they were over the airfield and parachute in for a grand entrance. But today had proved to be too much, and Captain Yuri nixed the idea. Today's milk run had caused too much damage, and many aircraft needed to land with priority, and frankly, the airfield did not need the distraction. To be completely honest, at some point, luck runs out, and Captain Yuri did not want Roskovich doing anything risky. The ground crews had counted the aircraft. 14. They could not believe 14. Maybe some were just late. The aircraft started to land, and the ground crews were hoping the next one in was theirs. They soon found out not everyone was coming home. Major Wilson was in first. Once they had gotten under altitude, freezing point, General Armstrong and the rest of the crew had a hard time slowing the bleeding in Salternick's leg. The surgeon would get to Salternick in time to save his life. He had lost nearly all of his blood. Unfortunately, the story has a tragic ending when Captain Salternick dies 10 days later from a blood clot, just when it looked like he was going to recover. The crew of the Old Faithful stripped Tech Sergeant Roskovich down to his underwear, then painted a 25 on his chest and back. He was then paraded around the base, and the party began. They started a tradition of painting, parading, and dunking in water. Andy Rooney had a story, which would find its way to newspapers across the United States on the accomplishment of the mad Russian, Michael Roskovich. Tech Sergeant Stymax was happy to see his friend and joined in the harassment and celebration of his friend. Years later, he would reminisce about his friendship with Michael Roskovich. The 306 had lost 4 aircraft and 4 crews. The measure of a successful mission was when all planes and crews made it back safely to Thurley. This was anything but a successful mission, but it had a very historic moment for the 8th Air Force in World War II. Tech Sergeant Roskovich was the first to reach the 25 mission barrier, which was a milestone for these early pioneers of the 8th Air Force, who were flying missions with only partial air cover and protection. Other flyers would soon reach the milestone. World War II enthusiasts are all familiar with the Memphis Belle and her race to 25 missions as an aircraft and crew, but the Michael Roskovich name is a bit of a mystery. I could do a whole chapter on Roskovich, probably more, but again, this is a tangent that I'm not going to be able to pursue, but I wanted you that are listening to know how this young man fits into our story and why I have been talking about him in our episodes. Once again, I found something while looking for something else. This April 5th, 1943 mission was not on my original radar because it was not on Lieutenant David Steele's mission report list, so I never thought much about it. However, when I flipped through it, I noticed that Steele was flying and aborted and therefore did not get credit for a mission count. This mission then had extra meaning due to Tech Sergeant Michael Roskovich and his importance to the 306th, the 8th Air Force, and the Steele crew. I then felt like it was important to at least acknowledge Roskovich's accomplishment and to have it be a part of our series. Once I started the research, I found anecdotes that were part of a larger story. The April 5th, 1943 mission to Antwerp has a wealth of interest, intrigue, and solid history, depending on what you like. So I encourage you to dig a little further, because you will soon find yourself in a web with Pips Priller, Michael Roskovich, and the First over Germany General. Our next mission will take us into May 1943 and starts off with a bang. Now that I am typing this, I suppose I better wade through the other April missions to double check Steele was not involved in any of those missions, but also had an abort. I quickly checked and found the Meathound did participate in 2 other April missions. So more on that in the next episode. Thank you for listening, and until next time, just think of the things you may find when you are looking for something else. Gaspar, out.